So hi everyone, welcome to our Special Topics in Education webinar series. Um, Kimberly Avila will be presenting on 5 tips for better digital classroom accessibility. My name is Chanel Figueroa. I will be moderating the session and providing any tech support if needed. And to get us started, am going to launch a poll. So you should see a poll come up with just one question. I'm going to launch it now. And I'll leave it up for about a minute and a half.
So our poll is asking for what your role is. Are you general education teacher, special education, related service provider, administrator, school technology specialist, school staff, instructional assistant, parent? And of course, I know a lot of you wear many of these hats. So that's certainly okay to click other. And I do want to let you all know we have a sign language interpreter. If you want to access the sign language services, please pin Jennifer Cranston on your Zoom screen so you can engage with our sign language server. We also have a live captioner. So if you would like captioning service, you can access that. I see it's up on one of my screens and not one of my other screens. So I'm not sure if there was a setting on one and not the other. But if you need captioning, we do have our live captioner. Chanel and I just posted a handout. It's a link to a web page, and there is a link to a Word document for 5 tips for better classroom accessibility. And it goes to a Word document that you can download and edit as you like, or change if you like. Okay, so I think we're getting some good responses. Looks like we have 31% general education teachers, 25% special ed, 4% related service provider. We have 10% of administrators, school technology specialists 10%, school staff 2%, instructional assistants 6%, parents 8%, and other 17%. So welcome everybody. Chanel, did you want to start off with anything?
No, I think for now, I think we're set. And if you aren't able to see the transcriptions at the bottom, there is an icon with a square with the letter CC on my screen. It should be on your screen. Make sure that that's clicked, and you should still be able to see the captioning at the bottom. But like I said, if you do have issues with that, just put a question in the Q&A, and I will help troubleshoot that. And with that note, I'm going to mute myself
Okay.
to give Dr. Avila the floor.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm just closing out the poll. Looks like we have a large percentage of general and special education teachers, so welcome. My name is Kim Avila, and I coordinate the teacher preparation program in blindness and vision impairment at George Mason. And so, of course, a lot of the work I do in accessibility is for our students who do have a vision impairment or are blind, but this session is going to be encompassing of all individuals, or at least as many as I can cover in an hour, who can benefit from accessibility, and not only our students, but adults. Some of you might have some accessibility considerations, parents, your colleagues, your friends, your aging parents, and so many more. So we're going to delve into that topic. Hold on 1 second. So I want to first of all start off by saying that we do have a critical shortage of teachers in Virginia. So George Mason has a multitude of educational programs for initial licensure and add-on credentials. And we also now have bachelor undergraduate degrees in education and special education. So on our screen here and in the handout, we do have our advisor prepared this for you all. If you want to learn more about adding on a credential or convincing a neighbor to go into education, or and your own kids, your own students, we have a lot of programs. These are the special education programs. And I coordinate the blindness and vision impairment program. We do have a grant that covers up to 60% of your tuition if you want to seek initial teacher licensure or add-on licensure in blindness and vision impairment. The program is primarily online. So 12 years ago, I made the change to teaching through web and video conference, very similar to how many of you made the change within the past year to teaching through Zoom and Ultra and WebEx and all the other programs. So it's something I have a lot of empathy for that transition because it is a big change. It does take a lot of consideration. And our adapted program also has a grant. Mason also has courses in American Sign Language, and then we have a PhD program in special education and disability research as well. So several choices for you, so feel free to access those. And like I said, we also have an undergraduate program in education as well. So accessibility is a really comprehensive topic, and I'll be the first to admit I am not the most highly technical person. My husband is a programmer and he does a lot of the accessibility, the highly technical components, and about 95% of what he says, I don't understand a word of it when it comes to the accessibility. But I do understand as an educator and as a person, I have low vision myself, and I understand the magnitude, the need to have accessible materials for people with disabilities, but also for people who don't know that they benefit from accessibility. So, because this is a really large, comprehensive topic, I'm only going to be able to touch on a few topics tonight, things that I hope will get you started and help get you pointed in the right direction and to help support more students in your classroom. But just know that there's so much more to this, even beyond, well beyond what I can even portray. So we have a lot of students who have various disabilities that we know they benefit from digital accessibility. And prior to the pandemic, I used to have sessions just like this, where I would teach other teachers about the importance of accessibility. And I would probably get 8 or 10 people enrolled in those sessions. And most of the people I knew, they were my friends or my students in my program. And now last I looked, we had 130 who registered for this session. And so there's so many more people that benefit from accessibility. So this is an ongoing dialogue. But on the next slide, I have a list of just some of the people who benefit from accessible materials. So some of you may be well aware that people who are blind and visually impaired need accessible materials. We use screen readers, we use braille devices, we use all sorts of technology. And you are correct, we need that accessibility. But what we also know is that there are individuals who see just fine, but also need that embedded accessibility in order to access their materials, in order to be more equitable in the way they get access to literacy. So I want to ask you all first, and Chanel, do we have our second poll, or the accessibility one, level of understanding?
Yes, let
Okay.
me see if I can pull that up.
So the next poll is going to ask you what is your perceived level of understanding of accessibility? So there'll be choices for beginner to intermediate to expert and so on. And while Chanel's there, it is. So if you could just let me know what your what your level is right now, so I can kind of help steer. If we have a room full of experts, then I'll need to go grab my husband and he'll have to give the presentation because that'll be above. So we have a lot of beginners. Okay. And I'm so thankful for you all coming in, by the way. And I have 2 school-aged kids and they are online. In fact, behind me sits my 7th grader. She takes her middle school courses every day right by me. And I know that our teachers are just working so hard to make this work for our students and to stay engaged. So I'm really grateful for that. So it looks like most people are in the beginner intermediate with some people in the advanced. And so that's good to know. Okay. All right. So, some of the other areas of disability that really benefit from accessible materials, we know that a lot of students who have learning disabilities, students who have processing disorders, students who have print disabilities, one thing we're seeing in the vision field significantly is an influx in the number of students who are being referred for vision-related services, even though they're not visually impaired. So they're being referred because they have something called convergence insufficiency. And basically, what that means is the student can have normal, pretty close to typical visual acuity. They may not even need glasses or contacts, but their eyes are just not converging when they read. We have a lot of students who have ocular motor issues. So scanning and tracking, locating and fixating. So again, their acuity, they go to the eye doctor, they're sitting there, they're reading the eye chart. Their acuity really isn't impaired, but there's a huge difference when you go to the eye doctor, you read a few letters on an eye chart for about 25 seconds, and you go to school and you have to read for 6.5 hours during the day. You have to read at a distance, you have to read close up, or as it is right now, a lot of us are reading on our computers. So we have a whole bunch of students who are falling in that category. We also have an influx in the number of students who are being diagnosed with vestibular disorders, traumatic brain injury, seizure conditions. We have students who have health impairments that some days they're functioning okay and other days they're not. Things like diabetes can affect the need for accessibility. We also have people with migraine disorders, and I know a lot of my teacher friends have migraine disorders because sometimes, just after a long day, that migraine sets in. We have people dealing with ocular migraines, which means that their vision is temporarily impacted. And then one thing that has really been a consideration over the past year is the implications of visual fatigue. So you can again be completely sighted, but you notice that your eyes are changing. And the longer you spend looking at your materials on your computer, you might get a little bit of diplopia, which is a little bit of double vision. And I took my kids to their eye doctor a couple of months ago, and he said he's just been flooded with people coming in. Typically they don't have any other history of vision conditions, no family history. They've seen fine their entire life, and all of a sudden they're experiencing some challenges. So there's a lot of folks who benefit from accessible materials, and of course, including my students who are blind and visually impaired, but so many others. And I'm sure some of you have stories and situations that you could share too as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the major considerations for accessibility just to get you started. But just to repeat something we said at the beginning of the session, because I noticed some people just logged in. If you'd like to access the handout for tonight, we did paste a link to the Word document. So if you go to that webpage, there's a Word document there. You can access that link. You can download the Word copy of the notes, and you can take your notes right in there. We also have sign language interpreter services. So if you pin Jennifer Cranston on your screen to access sign language, and then there's live captioning as well. So you'll have to access that link on your Zoom screen. Okay, so one of the first things I want to talk about is probably the most significant accessibility challenge that we have seen this past year. And for those of us in the vision impairment field, we've noticed this. This is nonstop. This is continual. But it's been just because we're accessing so many things online. A lot of you are making really neat interactive slide decks and interactive worksheets, which are super great. So I'm just going to tell you one thing to make those more accessible, and that is to please provide actual text and not images of the text. And that may not make a lot of sense right now, but I'm going to show you some examples. So just to kind of give you a little preference, so a lot of the conditions I just talked about, a lot of the vision related conditions, learning disabilities, dyslexia, and so on, when our students have images of text, they can't alter that text. They can't enlarge it. They can't change the spacing. They can't change the contrast. They can't do some of those customized settings. Same with our special ed teachers. So a lot of our kids have IEPs where they need decreased clutter. A lot of kids with learning disabilities benefit from decreased clutter. So one thing we are noticing right and left that come out, so let's say next week, we're going to have a different schedule in our school. We have a modified schedule. So our administrator sends out types up our new schedule for next week, and obviously they typed it up in Excel or Google Docs, or they typed it up somewhere, but then they take a screen capture. So they take a screenshot, a screen capture, and they paste that into the email that goes out to the entire school community. Or maybe you're setting the schedule for your class, and instead of just copying and pasting that table or that text, they're taking a screen capture. And so I have in your document, in the Word document, and then also on screen, I have a table with a simulated school schedule. This is the accessible one. So if you're following along in the Word document, if you don't like the colors I chose, or you want a different font, or you want to change the colors because that works for you, you can do that. So for me as a parent, I wanted to print out great big schedules for my kids and for myself. Okay, what class do you need to be in right now? Where do you need to be logged in at? And I printed out those schedules. But when they sent them to us as an image and not the actual text, I was unable to do that. So I have also in the Word document on the next slide too, this is a picture of that document that I typed up. So I just made something perfectly accessible inaccessible by turning it into a capture. So I'm also going to really specify this is about text, and I understand, there's maps and graphics and tables and charts and all sorts of visuals that our students are going to need to access. That's a whole different story. I could probably spend a couple of hours teaching you how to make those accessible. This is very literally text, and it happens so much that I had to start out this session by talking about this particular thing because it's affected a lot of people. So this particular table, if you're following along in Word, you'll notice you can't alter any of that text. You notice if you stretch it out, it's going to start getting blurrier. So that's an inaccessible example. If I'm using my screen reader that I use on my computer, it's not going to read it. Even though I can put something called alt text in there, even though I can give a description, when it's something as simple as text or this little table, which has columns and rows, which are actually very easy to navigate with the technology that we use, this presents a huge challenge. So we also have teachers who are needing to modify these things and put different types of visual targets or highlight salient features and make other modifications for their students who benefit from those supports. So we have a lot of teachers, and this is a simple example, but we have a lot of teachers who are taking text, creating it into an image, and then when we have our students who do need things spaced out differently, our teachers are having to go.
Yeah, I'm just gonna let people join.
All right.
I'm so sorry.
It's all right.
I definitely was. So let's see. Okay, so we are back up and running.
Thank you. So there was a little, I don't know, my second computer all of a sudden said meeting ended, and then my main one said the same thing. So welcome back. We were talking about how to make the more accessible materials, and I was mentioning that sending an image of text is not going to be accessible. It's going to create a lot of hassle, and it's going to be something that other special ed teachers are going to have to retrofit that accessibility. So I gave a very simple example of this particular table, how I had it in accessible format on the slide before, and then I had it in inaccessible format by turning it into an image. So huge challenge there. So another thing, so this is an example too. So let's pretend that you're in one of my graduate level classes and we're talking about accessibility, and I want you all to reflect back on 3 different disabilities and the benefit of accessibility for those 3 different disabilities. So I know a lot of you are making slides, interactive slides, and you're taking screen captures of text and you're putting it in the slide, and then you're asking for the prompt after. So what I did, I was naughty, and I took that slide from a few slides ago and I made it inaccessible. I took that beautiful text that my screen reader can access, that my student who has, color vision considerations could change or whatever, and I put it inaccessible here. So this image is not going to be accessible. It's more blurry. And for those of you who don't think it's blurry, that's awesome. But there's a lot of us who think it's extremely blurry and it's giving my eyes a little hassle right now. So this is an example of making a slide that's an interactive slide inaccessible. I have my text here with the prompt that I want people to respond to. And then, a lot of you have your students type in the answers, and I do that too. I do interactive slide decks as well. But the problem is when you put it in as text, when you put it in as an image of the text and not the actual text. So if there's one thing you can do to make your digital classroom more accessible is make sure you put the actual text in. So in PowerPoint here, this is an image. I can't click on it. I can't highlight that text. That's one way I know that it's inaccessible. The other text here for this interactive slide, I can highlight it. I can type in there. So that's going to be more accessible to my variety of students. The next thing are the 4 C's of accessibility. So if you've ever bought a diamond, you might have heard of the 4 C's. There's clarity, cut, color, I forget all the 4 C's of diamonds. These are the 4 C's for accessibility, and they won't cost you a thing. And they are color, contrast, clutter, and crowding. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about color vision, because color vision differences in our students and our colleagues and our students' parents varies significantly. Um, differences in the way people see red and green. We know that approximately 8% of the population of European descent males do not see red and green in the same way that other people do. We know that about 1 out of 200 of every women have different variations in color vision, and it's a spectrum. So I'm going to spend a few minutes on this because there's so many individuals. We have a large group here. I can guarantee some of you have students who have variations in the way that they see color. And, these students, this does not impact intellect. It does not impact ability. They will be able to go on to drive because they memorize the position of the lights and they look for which light is illuminated if they have red and green differences. So this is not something that is going to stop them in life. However, they really do need some considerations when you're developing your materials for school, because sometimes we convey information in color that really they need just another support there. And I'm going to give you some examples. So let's say we're in class today and the objective is I'm going to teach you all how to interpret a pie chart. And my class, theoretically, they'd already know their colors. And I want my class to understand that different parts of the pie chart represent different amounts. So we're going to practice interpreting that. So I'm giving them this slide where I want to ask them which color in the pie chart represents the greatest. So if you have typical color vision, you would be answering red right here. The problem is I can have a couple of students in my class that I'm testing their color vision and I'm not testing the interpretation skill of reading that pie chart that I'm really teaching. So what I did, and Chanel and I met before the session. There's an app called the Color Contrast Analyzer from Paciello Group. They also do simulations for different kinds of color vision. And I don't like doing simulations a lot in the vision field. I have a vision impairment. And when I see what other companies perceive how I see, it's like, no, that's not what it looks like at all. So I'm just going to show you this as a general idea. I'm not meaning to represent if some of you have different types of color vision differences. It's not meant to be an exact replication. It's to give people an idea. So for a person who might have some type of differences in the way they see red and green, their answer to this particular question is going to be different. So this is a simulator from the Paciello group showing what that same pie chart could potentially look like to a student who has red and green differences. And like I said, we have so many students who are affected by color vision. And one of the things that they tell us, and they usually, a lot of these kids with color vision differences. They don't necessarily get services from a teacher of the blind and visually impaired because so much of what can be done is integrated in the classroom and they're technically not visually impaired, but sometimes there's cases where it really does impact their education. So I can't say we never ever, we do have kids with color blindness on our caseloads, but they usually have something else. So you as the general education teacher, think about this. So when you're teaching, if you're teaching kindergarten and preschool and you're teaching colors, you really want to make sure you know what that student has and work with that support staff and curriculum advisor. You might have noticed that markers, so for a while there, they quit labeling markers red and green and blue. They just had the colors. And that was a real challenge. So the advocates have gone back and asked the companies making the markers to label them. And same thing with this pie chart. So I might have to actually go ahead and label the red section as red and the green section as green. Because again, I'm not testing their color vision here, I'm testing a different skill. The other example I have is so just a couple of ideas for you. You can provide the name of the color, you can provide the values, you can provide a chart, you can ask the student to outline the section with the greatest amount on that pie chart. So just a few different things that you can do there. This is an example. Let's say I was putting you all into breakout rooms and I wanted to divide you all into green and blue and red and yellow teams. So this is an example that might happen where I highlight or I write your names in different colors to tell you which team you're on. So can anyone in the chat tell me why that might be a challenge for a student with color vision considerations?
You can also type it into the Q&A function
Yes.
as well. If you're not, oh, here they go.
Okay. Yeah, so they can read their name, but they may not be able to tell they're on the red or the green team. So if I'm sending you all to breakout rooms and we have the red room and the green room, yeah, it's going to be a challenge. So what are some things you could do instead? Or just supplement the colors and fully knowing. So we have people in the blindness field who have neurological vision impairment and they see red. Red, they are drawn to that color, and I use red to highlight things. So it's going to be very different in certain circumstances. So, what are some things I could do here instead of just only providing it in red and green? Vertically stack the groups, yes. Put them all in different columns, adding an image. Yeah, I could do a few other things. I could put an asterisk, but yeah, I could label red team is going to be Chris, Natalie, Jose, and Vivian. I could put green team, and list them in those columns as an option. I can put an asterisk. I can underline as well. I can underline the green team and so on. So there's a lot of things you can do, and I'm just bringing this up because we have a lot of folks who do have those variations in color vision, and sometimes you have that student in your classroom, they're just not going to their breakout room and they don't want to tell you. They don't want to, that they're frustrated. They don't want people to think that they can't see colors. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with they have a legitimate the cones in the eyes are just different than other people's cones in their eyes. So they're not perceiving color the same way that other folks do. This is an example of an information sheet that might have come out that you might prepare, and you want to definitely get some required information from parents, but you also want to know if folks are going to volunteer. So I have and in the handout I labeled them with numbers. So if I'm sure there are people in the room who do have color vision issues, and so hopefully that'll help. But what's something I could do here? So what I did is I list like child's name, your name, email is required. It's in red. And then I put in green, I put, can you volunteer in the classroom? What cleaning supplies can you donate to us? So what are some ways that I could better prepare this sheet? And you may not even have a student who has color vision challenges in your class, but there could definitely be a parent who or a caregiver who does see colors differently. So, what are some things I could do with this particular sheet instead of using color to convey important information? It's Okay, so someone asked, can most people see black? Yeah, most people can, but we're going to get into some of that with contrast vision. So we do have students who have something called a chromatopsia, and they are our students who do see all black and white and grayscale. Usually those students have other vision considerations, and I do work with a lot of students with a chromatopsia, but our students who have some of the red and green and, it does affect some things, but they're not technically visually impaired. This is going to fall on the general classroom teacher. Label the categories, like a symbol or a key. Yeah, I could put required questions, then at the bottom, the optional questions. So lots of different things that I can provide there. And I do want to say, because I've known a lot of people in my life who do have different color vision variations, and sometimes they're embarrassed to bring this up, but it's really important that we develop materials, and this also is part of accessibility, web accessibility and digital classroom accessibility, because a lot of you will have students with color vision differences. Okay, the next thing is contrast. So contrast is our ability to perceive light and dark colors. So someone asked, are there people who can everybody see black in some capacity? And we do have students who are totally blind who can't, and students with no light perception who would not fall in that category. However, contrast vision impacts a lot of people. And we know that cataracts are forming a lot earlier in life. So we're seeing a lot of people being diagnosed with cataracts in their 40s and even their 30s. We have people who have different types of learning and reading disabilities where they really need varied contrast. And the reason why I bring up cataracts is because I run a program. Most of the people in the program that I run at Mason are not visually impaired, they're not blind. But because cataracts is one of the top 4 reasons people experience vision changes in life, a lot of these folks, they drive, they've never had vision impairment, but they're starting to notice that saturation and color is not as brilliant as it once was when they were younger. And it's oftentimes very gradual. Contrast also impacts people like me, people who have low vision, uh, students who will be in your classrooms, students who might be getting vision impairment services as a consult or on different capacities in their IEP, or they might have a 504 plan. But contrast can be very important also, because of vision fatigue, which a lot of us are struggling with right now because we are on our devices so much. Vision fatigue is very, very real. And so I'm just going to give you some examples of high contrast and low contrast on the next slide. So on the left side of the screen, I have gray, a gray background, and I have a light gray font that reads low contrast. On the right, I have a black rectangle and I have bright yellow. So the high contrast is the yellow and black, the low contrast is on the left. So one of the biggest things that we see a lot of web developers, we see some book publishers, electronic sources who are using like this gray on gray font. And I know it looks trendy and that's the style. I was at some hotels in DC where they did gray on gray to label the conference rooms. It was really difficult to see for a lot of people. But when our contrast vision is not as good as other people, this is going to contribute to avoidance behavior. We're going to start seeing kids who aren't going to want to engage as long because it just takes more effort and strain on the eyes to be able to see. And although this is very important for my students who have low vision, it's important across the board because our kids are spending, unfortunately, more and more time on the devices, and so much of what we're doing in school is electronic based. So if you've never had a challenge with contrast vision, I'm going to give you a couple of ideas on how to test for it because you may not even know are my materials high contrast, because that's not a challenge for me. And also some students who have different types of neurological considerations, processing disorders, and reading disabilities also benefit from high contrast. So that same app that I showed you earlier, and I can't pull it up right now because it won't let me share that app on the screen, but it's called the Color Contrast Analyzer. It's the same thing from that Paciello group that shows the variations in color vision. And that particular app allows you to take a sample from the foreground and the background of your content, and it lets you assess for contrast to know if it's high contrast or low contrast. But again, if you are not sure, if you at least provide the text in a format that my student can change. So I provided you with a Word copy of the notes for tonight. You can change it. If you don't like the font I use, if you don't like the colors I use, you can change all of that. So if you give them something that they can change, that's going to really help their advocacy efforts and their ability to self-adapt. So that's why providing that text is so important. So high contrast is really important. And just kind of going along with that concept of contrast, we're all different people. Each of us has our devices, our computer monitors, our tablets, our smartphones. Some of us like really bright things, some of us like things to be more dim. It's going to be across the spectrum. So for those of you who are assistive technology specialists in your schools, those of you who are special education teachers, are occupational therapists, I really encourage you to assess for this in your evaluations when you're preparing for IEPs. How does brightness affect that student? How does glare affect that student? Some kids, like people like me who are really fair, it's blinding. It causes migraines. It causes significant visual fatigue. But there are other folks, including other people who are visually impaired, who need things to be really bright. And that's where that individualized ability to set things is important. So, to the administrators who are on the call right now, when you are distributing laptops out to your students, I really want to encourage that you permit our students to make changes to contrast and brightness, because for some kids, that's going to make all the difference. And sometimes that's locked down with administrative rights. And for our kids who have IEPs, you might be able to override that, but being able to change those settings for some kids makes a huge difference. And even for us as adults. We have a lot of students who are having challenges with visual clutter, and this is not exclusive to vision impairment. This includes a lot of our students who have vision processing considerations, dyslexia, and other learning disabilities. So, for a lot of my kids with low vision, I do simplified formats. I take out some of the visual clutter. I fully realize you have students who need visual targets, they need visual stimulation. So, that ability to adapt is really important. But we have a growing number of students who visual clutter in your online classroom really creates some of their frustration. We do have research that talks a lot about the visual clutter in our classrooms in general in the physical environment, but having things simplified down doesn't mean that you're not working just as hard as everyone else, but trying to make that less clutter is sometimes very helpful. Also, kind of be mindful of the font you're using. On screen, I have an example of a crowded font, something that's squished together. And the challenge with a font like that for our students with dyslexia and print disabilities, it really distorts their ability to read. So if you give it to them in text and they can change it, that's great. But sometimes we hand out things that the font just really is that inaccessible element for that student, and it makes it a, a bit of a challenge as well. So those are just some of the four C's. I do see some chats, so why don't I just go ahead and take a look at our chat. So
We did get one question
yes,
in the chat, and then there are two additional questions
okay.
that were in the Q&A. But the question related to clutter and crowding of fonts is, what fonts do you recommend?
Yes. So a lot in Virginia, which provides our accessible books, they will provide things in sans serif fonts. So like Arial and the other fonts, not Times New Roman, that has the serifs. In the blindness and vision impairment field, we do something called a functional vision learning media assessment. And I specifically assess for what font works for that child. So if you are that special ed teacher, you are going to be doing an IEP pretty soon, making accommodations. It does need to be individualized, because I don't want to say Arial and sans serif works for everybody, because there's always people who view information differently. Some people actually do better with Times New Roman. So I might do something like an informal reading inventory where I give them different readings and different font styles and font sizes, and I take a look at their fluency. I take a look at, is there a way they're accessing their literacy better? And so if you provide the text to them, and we tell our student here, if you want Times New Roman, we're going to teach you how to change it. If you want Arial, this is how you change it. So really individualizing that, but a lot of the people in the vision field do go more sans serif. Was there another question?
We have a couple questions relating to incorporating text versus images or PDFs on
Okay.
websites.
Oh, yes. Okay, go ahead.
And then we had a question about, so I'll read the entire question. Great
Okay.
advice about image slash actual text. I often need to embed directions and things that I do not want to be interactive via an image, so there is less that is able to drag and drop, etc. Do you have any suggestions in that scenario?
Yeah, I'd have to see specifically. And you're welcome to email me if you all want to. My email is KAV, V as in Victor, ILA at gmu.edu. So sometimes I'll put it on a separate page if I don't want them to interact with that text. But if you put it in as an image, it's only going to meet the needs of that certain group of students that can access and see like you do, or access text like you do. So I would try to put it on a separate page. PDF accessibility. If you guys want to be here till 1 o'clock in the morning, then I'll stay here and I'll show you some things with PDF accessibility. So there's a lot to consider with Adobe, and they've made it a little I got to watch what I say. It can be a challenge. So this is something that I work with all the time because I also have to send out things, very specific forms in PDF format for my students to access and things that I don't want them to alter. And I have to go through a very specific process to assess for that accessibility in the PDF. And so I'm lucky because at George Mason, we have the Assistive Technology Initiative and they will help me with that. So I would definitely talk with your school systems about the PDF. I like the document that I gave you all, I could have saved that as a PDF and just given it to you like that. And it would have been accessible because I put headings in there. I also put row headers in there. So it would have been accessible, but you guys wouldn't have been able to change it if you want to take notes in there or if you want to change my font or whatever. So I would have to see the specific example. And then Chanel, what was other question?
How long does it take to get a book from
AIM
AIMVA?
Virginia.
So AIM Virginia, yeah.
Yeah, so Cindy George is our contact at AIM Virginia. It's going to vary. And so I recommend as soon as you know that you have a need, you want to go to your digital manager, your digital rights manager, who is designated to be your AIM Virginia person to input those orders and do them as soon as possible. I don't know the time deadline. I do know that during the pandemic, they have been working very hard. They brought their equipment home with them and scanners, and they were doing so much to get that. I don't know if Cindy or anyone else is on the call to chime in, but you can email me and I'm happy to pass along your question about AIM Virginia.
We had one more, one more that popped up. What was the name of the test you used to identify the fonts students should use?
Yes. So I use the John's Basic Reading Inventory, and we do have it in electronic format, and I can change the fonts specific to my student. So I can change the font style. And of course, since I work with kids who have low vision, I can change the font size. So any of those informal reading inventories, if you have electronic versions of the DRA or any of the others. I use leveled reading books that I have electronically that I can print out or that I can administer through electronic means. So it's just something to get on their reading level. So let's say you have a student reading on a very specific reading level. You want to give them materials maybe one level below that with the different fonts just to see, does that font style make a difference? But it's nothing super formal. It's just regular reading materials on their level. Any more?
Not for the moment.
Okay.
But if you do have additional questions, keep putting them in the chat and we'll take another break to answer more questions.
Yes. So I do want to talk a little bit about multimedia captioning, interpreter services, and audio description. I do want to start out by saying that captioning is not just for is for people who are deaf and hard of hearing, but also it's for so many other folks. I watched Hamilton over the break, and the lyrics in Hamilton are so impactful and significant, and they move so fast. I couldn't process it, and I don't have auditory processing challenges. I had to turn on captioning just so I could absorb it all. So captioning is just something you definitely want to look for in your materials that you're sending out, because we do have students who are not native English speakers who benefit. If you do have students who are deaf and hard of hearing, working with your school system on the interpreter services is very key. We have fabulous interpreters at Mason that we've come to our classes and to our events that work great. But I also need to say one thing, and I know some of you are going to laugh at me when I say this, but Braille is different than sign language. And some of you are like, that's completely ridiculous, Kim. Obviously, Braille is different than sign language, but I have to tell you, multiple times a year, for me as the coordinator of the blindness program, I get calls asking if I can send a Braille transcriber to do sign language interpreter services. And Kevin Taylor, our ASL program coordinator, he gets the same thing in the opposite direction. So if you are the one responsible in your school system, you want to make sure you're requesting the same service. And because this happens so much, don't be embarrassed, because it does happen, and we're happy to point you in the right direction. But I'm just mentioning that because it has happened enough that we want to make sure people are well aware of that. You might also think, well, we don't have a student who's deaf or hard of hearing. Why would we need these services? So if you are offering, if you're an administrator, you're offering parent meetings, you might have parents who are deaf and hard of hearing. You might have different community members and stakeholders. So you do want to have that dialogue open with your school system and how those services are requested and how they're integrated. Okay. The other thing, so there's something called audio description services, and if you want to see this in action, you can get on Netflix, and I watched The Haunting of Bly Manor with audio description. So it's a separate setting you can turn on, and it gives you audio description. So it's for people who are blind and visually impaired, people who have visual processing disorders, who need that supplemental audio description. So it's a really great option, especially if you have students who are blind, low vision, visual processing, that's going to give that little bit of extra detail. There were so many elements in that show that were highly visual. I didn't catch on to. The contrast was really bad. Like these creepy dolls are looking around and stuff like that. The contrast was awful. So that was super helpful for me. But going into something that's more scientific, a lot of you are doing science labs that are highly visual right now. They're not hands-on. And so, looking for those materials that have audio description is also really, really important. I want to encourage you also to give audio description of what's on your screen. So let's say I'm teaching a math class and I say the formula is on the screen. I really encourage you to say our formula is y equals mx plus b, and not just it's on the screen. And again, of course, for my kids with low vision, that really helps. But we do have a growing number of students who have to hear it. They have to hear things. And in the vision field, we were always told that learning is 90% visual. And the fact of the matter is, we dispute that. A lot of us dispute that because we have a growing number of students who see fine. They're drivers. They're, visually not impaired in any way, shape, or form, but they really need that audio support. So please do consider giving just some descriptions of things that are on your screens and your content that you're working through. Like I said earlier, we have a growing number of students and teachers and parents who are being diagnosed with vestibular disorders. They're experiencing dizziness, they're experiencing motion sickness even when they're not on a boat. And some of the things that we provide in our educational settings and our websites and our materials, there's a lot of tight lines. And I actually made a PowerPoint slide to show you what I mean by this. A lot of really close, tight lines, and it can make you dizzy. And I got dizzy looking at it, and I didn't want to get dizzy in front of all of you all. So I took that slide out. But just please be aware, we have a growing number of folks who have these considerations. We have a lot of students who do have seizure disorders. And if you have students at home and you turn on a video that flickers in a greater magnitude, that student could potentially have a seizure, whether they're in classroom or at home or wherever. So I did put the link to WebAIM They have information that can help you to understand how seizures can be impacted in your choices of materials. And I know I'm going fast, but I know we're running out of time, and plus we got a little interruption. So there's some things you can do in your documents too to help make them more accessible. So things that we talked about already, using high contrast, also using something called headings. And I don't have time to show you in Google Docs how to do this, but I'm just going to show you. I did take some screen captures. So this is an image. I didn't take a screen capture of the text, and then I provided an image description. But there's some things you can do to help. So on screen, I have a picture of the logo of my program, the Virginia Consortium for Teacher Preparation and Vision Impairment. And I put this into a Google Doc, but I need to let my blind and visually impaired and my other students know that this is an image, and I give it something called alt text. And the way you do that, you put your image in Google Docs, you right click or you hit the application key to open that context menu. You go down to alt text, and on the next slide, I have an example of what I did. I typed in a description of my logo, the shape of the Commonwealth of Virginia with a Braille letter V and a fingers reading the letter V in Braille. And beneath it, it says, the name of the program. Really easy to do. This gives a very short, brief description of that visual content. The other thing in Google Docs, so I'm showing Google Docs, but you can do this in Word too, is putting headings in. So headings are really helpful, especially if you have larger documents, if you have a lot of information. You can put something called a heading in, and that allows you to help your student, maybe who really needs that outline set up for them. They need help navigating big documents. Headings helps with that. So what I did here is I was actually making a sign up sheet for one of my spring classes for their presentations, and I wanted to put the name of the sign up sheet as a heading. And you'll notice too in the Microsoft Word document I gave you all, I have headings. The name is a heading 1, and all you do in Google Docs is you highlight it, you go up to the menu, the toolbar, and you go to headings, and I can select the top one as a heading 1. And then later on, my headings are going to vary. So it's kind of like an outline, and we use this a lot for our students who have learning disabilities, who really need to access the concept of an outline, and then also for my students who are blind and visually impaired who use technologies to be able to navigate a document. So the last couple things, and I apologize, I'm going so fast now because we are pretty much out of time. I want to encourage all the administrators and all of you on the call to, when you purchase materials, when you purchase applications, when you purchase electronic textbooks and your laptops and your tablets, to please inquire about the accessibility of those devices to the company that you're buying them from. So companies will oftentimes produce something called a VPAT, a voluntary product accessibility template. Companies do lie. They will say they're accessible and they're not. But I really want to encourage, when you are in that dialogue with your procurement team, to inquire and demand that accessibility piece. The reason why is when you purchase things that are inaccessible, it takes our special education teachers a great amount of time to retrofit accessibility in there. And most things I can't change. So I'm not a hacker, and I don't train our teachers of the blind and visually impaired to be hackers, because we don't do that, and I don't even know how to anyway. But we cannot hack into those systems and make them accessible. So that's a whole other process. So oftentimes we have our school systems that ask the special education teacher, okay, you pick the device that's going to work for your kids with special education needs. And while that sounds great, and I do like to give my opinion whenever I can, being an accessibility specialist, which is what my husband does, it is a very comprehensive full-time job. It goes into programming levels. It goes into all of these standards for accessibility that are way beyond what most of us in special education are. We're not in that technical setting where that's what they do 24/7. So we do need to hold our companies responsible and insist that they supply us with accessible materials and accessible uh, laptops and devices and apps and all of that good stuff. So as we're going back to school, these are just a couple of bonus tips. Really quickly, I want to encourage if you are back in school and you have plexiglass barriers around, because I am in the blindness and vision impairment field, um, we are having people who are running into those plexiglass corners and edges and barriers at great numbers, scratching their faces, corneas, etc. I really want to encourage you all to put some tapes, some high contrasting tape. I've had some teachers put contrasting foam because their students are banging into things. Um, just to kind of avoid some of those challenges. So if you are back in school, please do consider that. Remember that high contrast concept we talked about. So if your classroom, if it's near a white wall, you're going to want to use a darker color so that they can see it. Same thing with your social distance markers. If you have a beige colored floor in your classroom or your hallway, please don't use yellows and whites. You're going to want to use something that's high contrast. And this is not just for the blindness and vision impairment perspective. This comes from the what is noticeable, what catches the eye. So if you have a charcoal color floor, you're going to want to use light colors. If you have a beige light colored floor, you're going to want to use dark colors. So really consider that. How can you provide contrasting materials for all of your students? And finally, I also want to encourage that if you are distributing materials, your computers, your food system, your whatever it is, books that students are picking up, to also remember to provide walk-up directions for your families. So we do have a lot of families who don't drive, and my research through George Mason is on pedestrian access and pedestrian safety, and we have a growing number of people. We have parents who have disabilities who don't drive, but we also have a number of people who don't drive for economic reasons. People who are new to the US have not gotten their driver's license here yet. We have caregivers who they walk everywhere because they don't have access to a car, but they're caring for the children and running those errands. So I really want to encourage that if you have a drive up service where students can pick things up, make sure you also include provisions for walkers as well, and not only from disability perspective, but just to be inclusive in general. And finally, I want to encourage all of you all to please take very, very good care of yourselves. It is hard teaching online. And when I made that change to teaching for Mason via web conference 12 years ago, we have to rethink everything. It's completely different. Don't let anybody ever underestimate the power that you have, the hard work you are doing and you are putting forth, because it is a challenge. But I need you to take care of yourselves, because we do have that shortage of teachers, and we don't want anybody to come out of this pandemic burned out and ready to leave the profession. One thing in the vision field I want to encourage you all to look up is called the 20-20-20 rule. And that is where for every 20 minutes you sit on your device and you stare at it, you need to spend 20 seconds looking 20 feet away. The reason for that is it alleviates some of the pressure that our eyes go through for near accommodation. So when we're looking near, our eyes do a process called accommodation. It flattens the eye a little bit. And that is why we're getting so many people with myopia in this pandemic, because we're staring at our devices and our eyes are in that constant state of accommodation. So a lot of ophthalmologists are recommending after 20 minutes, set a timer, do what you, same with your students, for 20 seconds, look 20 feet away. So really important. The other thing is, please also put your monitors in a good ergonomic position. Please be mindful of that forward head posture and that leaning over. We're getting so many complaints about occipital neuralgia, which is a pain in the neck that goes up through the head and actually affects the vision. And I mean, it's just astronomical, the number of people who are dealing with these challenges during the pandemic. So I really want to encourage you to be mindful of your positioning to help yourself and to also hopefully alleviate some pain. And also to think about those customized settings that we talked about and to find what works for you, what works for your eyesight and how you see, just to alleviate some of that strain and fatigue on your own self. So I do have some resources. The Virginia Department of Education has published some things to help you out with accessibility. Assistive Technology Initiative at Mason does as well. And then we have national organizations and standard setting agencies that have really good information to help you if you want to learn more about accessibility. So I'll go ahead and take questions. Chanel, are there other questions in the box?
There are.
Okay.
Can you speak to dyslexic font and research that supports or disputes something? I think it was when we were talking originally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I would have to actually pull up my notes on dyslexia and different types of fonts. So there are folks who, that's where I encourage to find what works for that student, because we do have some conflicting research. Even in the vision field, we have research that says use all caps, and all caps for almost every student that I have worked with has been a real challenge because they use whole word recognition. They use that concept of being able to recognize a word by the shape that it follows. And you distort that when you use all caps. So I don't have the research up with me right now, but I encourage an individualized approach for all of your students, whether they have dyslexia or another learning or vision disability.
Is blue painter's tape a good color?
So that's going to depend on your setup and what you have. So if you have a lighter area, blue painter, I love blue painter's tape. I keep that with me all the time. I mark stuff for my students who have low vision all the time. So that's a definite option. But if you have, if your desk is a darker color and you have plexiglass on your desk and the blue painter's tape kind of blends in, that's going to be a challenge. I've had people use the yellow and black that you can get at like Home Depot, which is a good option. But just keep in mind that contrast. And even with the rounded edges on the plexiglass, just like putting a little foam on there. Uh, I went to the grocery store. I mean, there's people who are totally sighted who are bumping into them. So I don't feel like it's just me anymore, but it does happen.
And then the last question I see is, will you send a copy of the presentation?
Yeah. So we have, Janelle, are you able to copy the link? So you can access the Word copy. So I did put some images in here from the apps that I used. So I did put all the text in the Word document, so you can access that. And then the presentation, I have some images, and I have to check with Mason on what copyright is, because I know sometimes when we, like in my classes, I have to take images out and all that kind of stuff. But I do have the Word copy for you posted online.
And we did record this as well.
Okay, very
So
good.
make sure we take out the bump in the road and see if we can squeeze it all together.
It
But
happens.
we
It just
did
happens so
record it,
much.
yeah.
When I made the change teaching to web conference 12 years ago, I was like, in the classroom, I had to deal with like student behaviors a lot, and in the web, in the personal classroom, I had to deal with student behaviors and interruptions. But online, you have to deal with the technology misbehaving, and so it's a constant, which one's more challenging. But any other questions? Well, I want to thank all of you. And again, thank you so much for all you do. I have 2 school age kids. I'm inspired after teaching online for so long. We have newbies to teaching in web conference that I am just getting ideas from myself. And it's been a real honor to learn and to see the creativity and the ingenuity that you all have dedicated. And I hope you understand that there's a lot of us who are parents who are so grateful to everything you've done and to keeping those standards so high. My 10th grader is taking classes, chemistry and programming, and thankfully my husband's good at all of that because I'm not. And they've kept the rigor. I mean, it is hard. They are hard classes. So thank you all for everything you've done for keeping the standards high for our students. Okay, saw a couple other things come up. Chanel, were there other questions?
They are. I don't see any more. I think it's a lot of people saying they're learning a lot.
Oh,
So
good. Okay.
yeah.
And remember, we offer a grant that covers 60% of tuition for qualified applicants for the blindness and vision impairment program. If you just want to take a course and to renew your teaching license, you don't have to do the full program. You can take 1 or 2 classes as a non-degree, or you can add on a certificate. But I'm happy to communicate with anyone who's interested. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a happy new year. Stay safe. Please be healthy. All right, take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.